So you did everything you possibly could to discourage a weed from becoming a weed. But dang it, nature prevailed, and your organic field now just isn't as clean as you want it to be. Once a weed seed has the moisture and temperature it needs to germinate, that race is on. And that's a really good way to think about this weed control conversation as a foot race between you as a farmer and the weed. Luckily for us, there are no rules against cheating in this particular race. With the last cultivation happening just before planting, the cash crop and every one of those millions and billions of weed seeds are queued up on their starting blocks. It's anyone's race really at this point. But this is the moment, the first of many, when a farmer is going to trip those weeds up before they can even get off and make the first step. So that blind cultivation, which we'll talk about more in just a minute, clears the way for the cash crop to get a good stride in before the weeds get back on their starting block and try to come across the starting line again. That's what the season will be, keeping weeds as far behind your cash crop as possible and tripping them up with tools of increasing aggressiveness. Some of the weeds are going to finish the season along with your cash crops. You're never going to get them all. But if they haven't slowed down your cash crop or negatively affected your yields or quality, that's a win for you as a farmer. A quick note here, to recognize that most of the conversation revolving around these weeds are for row crops like corn, beans, and some pulses. And they're really not as applicable to our solid seeded crops like wheats and barley. But the key with those solid seeded crops is a good seed bed prep, upping that seeding rate, nurse crops, and a few other strategies to maximize the competitiveness of that crop. So let's start with that first trip up. Blind cultivation. Any backyard gardener knows that to kill a weed, you need to pull it up by the roots, right? But what if you could get to a weed before it even had roots? That's what blind cultivation in the white thread stage is all about. Blind cultivation means cultivating a field without consideration for where the field rows are and is generally more relevant for your corn and bean production. But it's also sometimes used for small grains. Like broadcast seeding, blind cultivation's goal is to cover as much ground as we possibly can and really quickly, generally 6 to 12 miles an hour. The all-important white thread stage is when weed seeds have just germinated but haven't even thrown down that taproot yet. Shallow but aggressive soil disturbance with a tine weeder, rotary hoe, or harrow dislodges the fledgling weeds before it even gets a foothold in the soil. This can be 24 hours before planting and then 24 hours after planting, and then again every couple of days as the soil surface produces new flushes of weeds. If you can see the weed, it's too late, is a common saying when it comes to early season weed control. To find the white threads, you need to get down on the ground and really dig around to see what seeds are germinated but haven't really taken root yet. And once you see that unmistakable white thread stage, that's the moment to begin blind cultivation. The theory is that you're dislodging those weeds when they're most vulnerable. They're newly germinated right at the soil surface, usually growing at an angle into the ground with really poor establishment. You can pluck it with literally no resistance. The second part of the strategy is to create what some farmers call a dust mulch, a thin layer of shallowly cultivated soil that isn't conducive to weed germination, giving the cash crop even more of a chance to cut ahead. It's two modes of action: uprooting and desiccating weeds, and then covering and smothering the weeds. The two most common tools for blind cultivation are going to be the tine weeder, sometimes called the flex tine weeder or spring tine harrow, and the rotary hoe, though harrows and other shallow tillage tools can also be used. There are a lot of variations and combinations within these tools, so we're not going to go into the specifics here. Instead, we'll give you a general application of each and point to opportunities to dig deeper into each of these tools in the lesson notes. The tine weeder is generally used for blind cultivation between planting and emergence, and then again after seedlings have established with 3 or 4 leaves. The second window closes just before jointing, when a crop can be hurt by that traffic. No matter the blind cultivation tool, the manager will need to take a break during the early, vulnerable stages like crook stage for soybeans, and then, once established, do maintenance cultivation until row crop cultivation starts. Tine weeders have a kind of dancing effect as they move through that soil, sifting around and disturbing those small aggregates that support early weed populations while skirting around those established cash crops. They can be adjusted in a few ways: the tine angle, the down pressure, and the tractor speed, depending on how aggressive you really want to be given your population and the crop. They're most effective when weeds are in their white thread stage, soon after germination, and before those fine hair roots form, which means that they're generally not that effective for dealing with an established stand of weeds. They also don't really shine in soils that crust or in high residue situations. In those situations, they can take the crusted soil and turn it into sharp scythes that just slice off your crop. And then in high residue situations, they can drag all that residue to the field edge. Established perennial weeds are never going to be well taken care of by a tine weeder. The rotary hoe has a similar application to the tine weeder, or harrows, but are better adapted to heavier soils with a tendency to crust over, or with fields with lots of residue. You can also cover more ground faster with the rotary hoe. There's lots of soil movement with these, so you'll want to make sure to use caution on windy days to avoid too much wind erosion. Both of these tools usually freak a farmer out because they're looking back and seeing their crop being just tearing apart. The most common advice is to just keep going and don't look back. It is possible to be overly aggressive, but with some trial and error and carefully checking that you're uprooting weeds by keeping that crop in place, you should be able to dial it in. Heavier seeding rates, dry, friable soil, and a slightly deeper planting depth can also support success. Summer fallow is similarly broadcast cultivation. By running a field cultivator over a field when terminating that cover crop in June or taking out a full field of weeds during your rest year in the rotation, you can interrupt the life cycle in a way that wouldn't be possible during a cash crop year. We're likely going into just frustratingly little detail with these tools, but there's so much diversity in the tools themselves as well as the farmers who use them that it's best left to producers themselves to talk about what they use and why. We'll hear from some of our focus farmers in a future lesson, but I also want to point to a great organic weed control series that Practical Farmers of Iowa put out a couple of years ago that highlights lots of different farmers about what they use, when, how, and why. So we've gotten our crop out of the ground and it's well established and we've kept the weeds at bay. But what weeds are left are getting a little more mature now, and we're a little too far along in the maturation of our crop to not do more harm than good if we took a tine weeder or a rotary hoe over it. It's time to bring in the crop cultivator. Moving to a traditional cultivator lets you kill between row or inter-row weeds and throw soil on those weeds that are in the row next to the stem. Moving to a traditional cultivator in row crops like soy, corn, sunflowers even, allows you to focus on between row cultivation, which is also critical to suppressing the weeds that are in the row next to those stalks. By cultivating until the crop is canopied, you keep that soil area really inhospitable to the weeds. You can think of this as you're going to raise your kids up until they can really fend for themselves. At canopy, you're sending your kids off to make their mark in the world and get out on their own. How you raise them, though, will have lasting and compounding effects even after you stop tending them. This is all pretty common sense stuff, but the how is key. If you miss an important cultivation window, or don't have your sweep set to throw enough dirt into the rows, or breeze past the white thread stage, you could be setting yourself up for future failure. Again, it's the many small hammers approach. As many strategic cultivations as you need in order to get an overall clean field are warranted. If you're interested in taking a very deep dive into cultivation, there's a farm manager and consultant in Central Illinois named Gary McDonald who can only be described as the cultivation guru. He put out a great video series with O-Grain on his cultivation systems, and it's worth taking a look. And for what it's worth, his fields are some of the cleanest I've ever seen. And there are tons and tons of different sweeps and shovels for different applications. Also different shanks, and from a Danish tine with more vibration to a C shank that's shaped more rigid and durable. There are also tools called rolling cultivators that are slightly less effective at uprooting the weeds, but work the surface really well and are better for close to row cultivation. Finger weeders that use plastic wheels that thread into one another to remove in-row weeds are becoming more and more popular, but they really are best paired with an optical guidance system. Which brings us to Optical guidance systems that sense a crop's presence to keep the cultivator on track and between the row, letting farmers cultivate faster and more precisely, sometimes even correcting enough to make cultivating on a hillside possible. A hydraulic side shift hitch is automatically controlled and can take a lot of the guesswork and cultivation blight out of the process. Wands can accomplish a similar function and may be cheaper, though it's less foolproof technology and can't distinguish between a crop and a weed as some camera guidance systems can. Using a tractor's GPS RTK system is a simple and elegant tool for use in cultivation. Some old school farmers might scoff at the tech as not real cultivation, but organic was never about doing things the hard way for no good reason. If there's a tool that makes a farmer's life that much easier and their fields that much more productive, use it. Older tech, if you can call it that, like guidance rods and mirrors, like cultivisions, are still widely used. And that's probably because they are simple and effective tools that will never go out of style. In the end, it'll just come down to what machines you're already working with, what the budget is on your farm, and how tech-savvy someone or someone's consultant is. So that, my friends, is the 101 of weed control in row crops. Blind cultivation until establishment, and then row crop cultivation until canopy. But Dr. Adam Davis, a professor of agronomy at the University of Illinois, has some words of caution about an over-reliance on physical control early in the season.
I would say you also want to think about, having different tools for physical weed control. And so only relying on a rotary hoe is going to get you into a situation where things that have stiffer stems and more push power are going to be able to survive it, and you're going to be selecting in that direction. Using a spring tine harrow is a great way to deal with things in the white thread stage in a young crop. So maybe you start selecting out the part of the community that emerges very early, and then you've got late emergers coming up. Everything that you do is going to act as a selective filter. It's not if, it's just how. I like to think about a pitcher in baseball as a metaphor. Like even if you've got a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, if you keep throwing that, the batter's going to adapt and slam it out of the park. And so that's why pitchers have a full complement of pitches, is that they have to keep the batter guessing. And in the same way, if you want to use a flamer, think about end of season weed control with the Harrington seed destructor. And now you've reduced the number of seedlings that are going to emerge the following spring by reducing the number of seeds that went in that fall.
Thanks, Dr. Davis. Although these tools will likely make up the majority of a traditional organic weed control program in row crops, they are far from the only tools out there. In the next lesson, we'll cover the rest of the arsenal available to organic growers and help you figure out what, when, and where each of these might be used.